welcome to the Science Fiction Bookstore. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Shaun Tan.
Hello.
So, this is your first time in Sweden?
Actually, my second. I was here briefly in 2008. Yes.
So, does it feel the same as last time you were here?
I think the weather was a bit better last time, actually. But no, I've had an opportunity to see much more this time round. Yeah, it's been really great. I really enjoyed being here.
So you're here for a special reason this time. I don't know why you were here last time, but you just received an award. Could you please tell the audience a bit about that?
Yes, it's the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, which I understand many of you would already know about.
Yeah.
Less well known where I'm from in Australia, but it's an award for the whole body of an artist's work. There's about 160 nominees from different countries, and they happen to have chosen me as the recipient for this year, so for which I'm eternally grateful.
So this is a science fiction bookstore, so I would like to ask you a bit about your geekdom.
Yes, my geekdom.
Yes, I heard that you started illustrating science fiction novels when you were a teenager.
Yeah, science fiction short stories for small magazines, which were published in Australia, and particularly in Perth. Perth is a very small city in Australia, and it still has an active science fiction community. I think the smaller the place, the more active the community. And a group of friends got together and they started publishing science fiction stories by Australian writers. Of course, also being a small city, there wasn't a great pool of artistic talent to draw on, but I had an interest in science fiction illustration, and so I came across this group when I was in university, and I started to illustrate science fiction stories. But originally I wanted to be a science fiction writer, and I wasn't successful in that pursuit, so my stories were being rejected constantly, and so I started to attach illustrations onto the front of the stories just to get an editor's attention, and it kind of had the, well, not the intended effect of getting my stories published, because they were still rejected, but then they became so interested in my illustration that they asked me to illustrate other people's stories. So for many years I was illustrating other people's stories, and only quite recently returning to writing myself.
There is a lot of science fiction element in all of your work, and a lot of fantasy. Do you still read a lot of that sort of fiction? See that sort of movies?
Yeah, I do, and although I seem to have less and less time, a lot of my attention is devoted to children's literature, but I'm very interested in merging the different genres, so I kind of always work between genres. I never see myself as entirely a children's creator, or entirely science fiction, or entirely fantasy, or entirely in the fine arts, but I'm sort of in between. And I think sometimes, you know, we live in a world where the cultures are separated quite arbitrarily, you know, like comics, science fiction novels, children's books, and there's actually not that much difference. In fact, most writers do skip between the genres, and so I have a great interest in closing the gap. But I do regularly attend science fiction conventions. Most of my social group are involved with science fiction fandom and so on. So it's a familiar world to me. I always feel comfortable at a con.
There is a lot of, in your illustrations, there are very, a lot of, how should I put it, you seem to merge a lot of technology with living tissue, in a sense.
Yes, like natural and artificial things mixed together.
So where does that inspiration come from?
Well, it's really a reflection of real life. You know, I think we're so used to the reality around us that we don't notice how bizarre it is. I mean, all of you here today would probably be more aware than most, and that's where my interest in science fiction comes from, is the recognition that the time that we're living in now, like in the 21st century, is possibly the most unusual time for this species on this planet. I mean, it's really strange, and it's a mixture of technology, and still natural things. But we're still animals, and we still have our connection to the natural world, psychologically and, you know, through food and so on, our biology. But at the same time, we live in an extremely technological world, and psychologically that's starting to become a bit blurred with screen culture, and cyberspace and artificial realities, whether it's genetic engineering or something else. And it's a kind of twilight zone, and so that fascinates me. And I try to express something of that visually by having creatures that are almost animals or mutants that are half technology and half life form. Because in our own world it's so mixed up, you know, and it sort of is a metaphor for that in some ways. If I wanted to be intellectual about it, if I wanted to be honest, I would just say I really like drawing a TV set with tentacles coming out of it, you know. But somewhere along the line I realised that there are actually deeper meanings and reasons behind those aesthetic choices.
So who are your biggest inspirations as far as other artists go?
Well, the reason I got into science fiction in the first place was watching really late night episodes of The Twilight Zone when I was about 11 years old. And these were the old black and white ones. And this was the first time I'd actually really come across stories, at least outside of some children's books that I read, stories that were really kind of disturbing and unsettling, but in a good way. Like they were never really finished, and I liked that they were short. But I didn't know what they were. I didn't know what the genre was. So I asked a local librarian, this is as a kid, you know, what is this? Because I would like to, I can't wait every Thursday at 11 PM for an episode of Twilight Zone. I would like to read more of this sort of fiction, you know, can I find it? And she wasn't really sure what the genre was, but she said it was science fiction and gave me this bookmark. And the libraries in Australia often have this, like a bookmark that has just a genre like romance, science fiction, history or whatever, and then a list of, in alphabetical order of prominent writers. And so she gave me the science fiction one, and it had, you know, of course, Isaac Asimov at the top. And I read a few of those, and I thought, that's kind of interesting, but it's sort of a bit science-based, you know. It's kind of like a realistic future, and I wasn't that interested in realistic or hard science fiction. And the next one down was Ray Bradbury, and I basically never got further than that because I read everything that Ray Bradbury ever wrote, and that became the biggest influence probably on my development as a writer and illustrator, was the short stories of Ray Bradbury. And I don't like all of them. I have a kind of mixed feelings to his work. Sometimes they're a little bit sentimental and almost a bit twee and overwrought, but they're so bizarre and they're kind of like fairy tales for adults. And that's kind of what I do now. This book in particular, Tales from Outer Suburbia, is really Ray Bradbury-esque. I was actually I didn't know it at the time, and then it was published and I was reading it, and it reminded me of what I was reading as a teenager. And I was pleased that some critics actually mentioned that it reminded them of Ray Bradbury. The idea of taking an ordinary suburban situation and introducing some kind of twist, a strange element, and then seeing how everybody reacts. For me, the interesting thing isn't the strange element, it's the reaction of people. Like, how do you react when you're confronted with something that doesn't make sense and challenges your ideas of what's normal and what's safe and what your home is and these sort of things that we take for granted.
Now I would like the audience to ask any questions if you have any. Yes?
Favourite episodes of The Twilight Zone? Let's see. There was one called The House on Maple Street or something like that, and it was, or I can't remember the exact name, but basically it was a small town in Midwest America, as often the case, and strange things kept happening in one house, and it was designed to, well, the neighbours all thought that there was some sort of, that the people were aliens or something. Or there was a rumour going around that aliens were coming, or they're disguised as people. And so there was this one house, and strange things would happen, and all the neighbours would notice. And so they started to really persecute this family because they thought that they were aliens in disguise. There was always this suspicion. And it was partly sort of a red terror kind of feeling too, so it was kind of a reference to fears of communism. And then other houses, things started happening, you know, and the neighbours started to become suspicious of those things, and they were very simple things like just lights turning on and off really quickly and stuff like that. Lawnmower starting to move by itself. And after a while, the street just became basically a riot scene, where all these normal middle-class families just started turning against each other and going crazy because they couldn't understand what was going on. And the sort of episode ends with the real aliens are up on a hill, hidden from view, just watching the people there, and all they're doing is they've got some switchboard and they're making lights and things go on and off. They're not actually involved in the community. And they're just saying to each other, yeah, this is how we always invade, you know, it's much easier to let them kill themselves. Then we move in, and our job is much easier. And so that's a good example of a kind of story that I find appealing.
Anyone else? No more? Okay.
Yeah. The universe has to be a creature on the lost thing there.
Yes.
The creature,
yes.
Did you get it from Mantis, or because it's kneeling, and Mantis would not be kneeling, and it has 6 other legs.
Yes.
Yes. So it can't be an insect, or could be a spider.
Yes.
I think you got the idea from Mantis, but then it would be a regular thing, and you have put something says farewell to the little guy there. I noticed that he had on his some small bells. Some small bells. There are small bells there.
Ah, yes,
just
yes.
to take away
The threatening quality of the creature. Yeah. The basic idea for this creature, I mean, also there's something about the form of things in my stories that's somewhat arbitrary. Like, if you imagine that a story is an algebraic equation and there's always an x in there, the x is the creature, and it could be anything, and so it's never named. The main thing is that it just looks really weird, almost to stop you from identifying it. But to answer your question, the inspiration of for the creature came from maybe the first pet that I ever owned, which was a hermit crab. You know, I don't know if you have them here, little crazy crab. It doesn't live in the water, but it uses the shell of another creature as its home. And so I had seen cases where the crab has used a Coke can or some artificial object as a home. And that always fascinated me. Again, it's sort of like the natural and unnatural coming together. And so that was the basic idea. I was thinking about that sort of, and the story has themes of belonging, and the creature is homeless, and so the idea of a hermit crab seemed appropriate. But also, you know, introduce elements of octopus and pot-bellied stoves. So I was actually doing lots of drawings at the time of old Victorian pot-bellied stoves, and I thought that would be like an interesting shape. And then the top of the creature is kind of taken from the top of a particular dinosaur, which is a Pachycephalosaurus, which is this dinosaur that used to butt heads, and it's very thick-skulled, and it has little horns, a crown of horns on the top. And I thought, well, that'll do. That looks good. But basically, I keep drawing things over and over again, and then other details like the personality come out when I add little bells. So the idea that it doesn't speak, but it just rings little bells.
Right. Thank you, Shaun Tan. And now the audience may come up and have their book signed, right?
Okay, great.
Thank you so
Looking
much
forward to meeting you.
Thank you for coming and visiting us at the Science
Thanks.
Fiction Bookstore.
Thanks.
So give him an applause. Thank you.